Welcome to a homegrown family podcast where we grow the produce and the kids. Hey everybody, welcome to a homegrown family podcast. I'm your host, Joe Metler, and today I have a topic that we have to discuss that I honestly don't know a whole lot about, which is interesting enough because most of the time in these episodes it's talking about gardening or farming or making your own produce or something like that, and I kind of have some experience or some knowledge about the topic. And growing your own livestock for your meat or growing your vegetable produce or doing some canning and things like that will be topics that we'll talk about. And I had a friend of mine, Michelle Sevigny, is joining us here today. She's been on here previously with her husband Jake talking about some homeschooling experiences growing up, and she had volunteered to talk about sourdough. And I'm like, oh, great, that sounds like an awesome topic because I think a lot of my listeners would be interested in this. So welcome today. Thank you for joining us and thank you for volunteering.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You might regret saying that you're good with me talking about sourdough because I always think I don't have much to say, and then I get into a conversation, and I have definitely been guilty of Jake walking into the room and going, oh, there she is talking about sourdough again. So you may regret it.
Well, hey, that means you're passionate about it. You can go off, get the right people in the room. My brother and I can talk about mushrooms for an hour,
It's true.
This is crazy. So I don't have a whole lot of experience with sourdough. Recently, my wife's tried and attempted the recipe herself. Actually, she first approached me 2 months ago and was like, hey, how about we should try some sourdough? I'm like, I got so many ovens in the fire. I've got so many hobbies. How about you take that on? If you want to do sourdough, you do it. Go for it. And so one day she finally tried it and put, I don't even know what she did. I didn't even pay attention. Some yeast together and stuff, and said she had to feed it and this and that. And next thing I know, it's not working. It's not bubbling at all, and she throws it out, Unsuccessful, right? And then a friend of ours caught wind of it. My wife was trying to get sourdough going, and he had a starter or something, was splitting his off or something like that. Yeah. And so I have that sitting in my fridge. So we'll see what happens soon. Maybe we'll learn something along the way here. But so I do have a little bit of experience with bread in general. Mm-hmm. Growing up, I was involved in 4-H and things, and we always, it seems like everybody and their mom had, and probably some of their moms actually, baked some goods for them at the county fair, And so I used to participate in that with my mom, and bread was kind of my sister did the bars and the cookies and all that stuff. And I'm like, I got to do something different, something challenging, something that's going to make me win. And so I got reserve champion a couple times doing a cinnamon bread, a braided rose roll, braided bread in a rose roll kind of thing. Yeah. I just remember rose roll I brought into the fair. I brought it in. I had a pack of 4. I was proud of these things. They were looking good. Yeah. Judge goes to me, where'd you buy these? I was like, no, I didn't buy them. I swear. But I think that one went to the state fair too. And then within that certain group of counties, I did get a champion at the Minnesota State Fair for the rose roll. So nice. That was kind of cool. Yeah. Yeah. But you're about to teach me something here today. So how'd you get into making sourdough?
So I mean, going back all the way to COVID, 2020, I was really getting into baking. I've always liked baking, but I was really getting into making bread. And then, COVID hit and there were shortages of everything. And so there was yeast shortages. And everybody seemed to be making sourdough because it makes its own natural yeast. All you need is flour and water and some salt, and there you go. You have everything you need to make a loaf of bread. I thought, well, that's great, but I kept on researching it, and there is so much information on sourdough out there. So much. It's great, but it's also so overwhelming when you first start. I even asked a friend of mine who said she was making it, and it's so easy. And I was like, I cannot understand this. So yeah, I had this friend of mine explain to me her starter, but everybody who I asked seemed to be under the impression that it was very easy, and I could not comprehend it. So I did not do it. And I actually had found too, right around that same point in time, a random store that had a bunch of yeast. So I bought a ton of yeast and then I just moved on with my life. But I always had it in the back of my head. I want to try this sourdough stuff. So I moved up to Washington, we got married, and then we moved over here to Yakima. And I happened to be scrolling through the Nextdoor app, where everyone in your neighborhood will kind of be on it. It's kind of like a social media, but people will post if they have things to give away or if they're looking for something. I was scrolling through one day and someone said she had some starter does anybody want starter? And I thought, well, great, I'll get this and then I'll just figure out what to do with it.
You say starter. I don't even, if I didn't have an inkling of what this was about, what do you even mean by starter?
So a starter is essentially what is the yeast, quote unquote. That's what's going to give you all the leavening for the bread. But all it is flour and water. So anybody who starts off and makes their own starter from scratch, I just applaud, because it is so much. It's not really a lot of work in terms of what you're doing, but you're putting in a lot of time before you see anything, because you're essentially activating the bacteria that's already naturally occurring in the flour and in the water, and it's essentially eating all I think it's the carbohydrates, but it's eating the sugars in the flour. And so eventually it will obviously eat all the sugar. And so then you have to refeed it, and be putting a little bit more flour and a little bit more water and monitoring that way. But when you start it off, you're at least a week to 2 weeks before you're seeing anything that you could possibly do.
There's no yeast at all added whatsoever anyway in the process.
Mm-mm. No.
Okay, so my wife started a starter, or started making one from scratch, I guess, right? Because she didn't get it from anybody. She bought this little kit online and had a little fancy glass, and I don't even know if you need to use a fancy glass. I mean, you just could probably use a mason jar or whatever.
Yeah.
But she bought this kit, and so she's trying to get it going, and so maybe we just didn't give it enough time to really activate.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm currently going through, my sister actually, I really benefited from getting a starter that somebody already had. Now, granted, once I got the starter, I still didn't know what to do with it, and I still kind of put it in the fridge and figured it out. Found out months later that I had been feeding it all wrong. But the good thing about a starter is that it is very, very difficult to kill your starter. You can essentially, the only thing that will kill your starter is if you get mold on it. So you could have your starter go completely dormant. Maybe you've had it sitting in the back of your fridge and now it has a layer of, what looks like kind of colored water on top.
Hey, that's exactly where we're at. I have 2 jars sitting in my fridge with liquid water on top, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah. So that is what is called hooch, and it's essentially what is produced as a side effect because the bacteria in there has nothing else to eat. So it's essentially sweating out because it doesn't have anything to eat.
This is something really tasty.
I know. You can just stir it in and then just move on with it, or you can pour it out. Some people do either way. At this point, it's always really freaky when you see that at first because you're like, what is going on? But I wouldn't say frequently, but I will sometimes forget, or I go on vacation and sometimes I'll come back and it's in the back of the fridge and I go, oh, okay, well, there you go. I've got some of the hooch going on. Okay, no big deal. It just means that when the next time I feed it, it might take a little bit longer to become active for me to use again. My biggest piece of advice for people who are starting with sourdough is because there is so much information out there, and it's really good information. And there's, Facebook groups, there's Reddits, there's everything, and it's all great. The sourdough community generally is very nice. The problem is that you can really easily get information overload and just see picture after picture of a perfect loaf or what you think looks like a perfect loaf. And then someone goes, oh, there's something wrong with this loaf. I overproofed it. And you're like, that looks like a great loaf to me. I don't understand why they're complaining about this. And then you get freaked out and then you just shove your starter in the back of the fridge. And then you're like, I don't know what to do. My piece of advice is you find one thing, one video or one recipe, and then you just kind of follow them until you get a little bit more comfortable. And then you can start expanding. What I have found is the best, and what I send to people who are starting, is King Arthur Baking has a really great like tutorial, essentially breakdown on sourdough. And it'll show, okay, if you're just starting with your starter, here's this. If you are, here's how to feed your starter. Here's a recipe. If you're a visual person like I am, Claire Saffitz is this baker, and she with the New York Times has a whole video that she talks about how to bake the sourdough, and she's, in how to feed it and all these kind of things. And just find one, go from there, because the thing is that sourdough is really it is in fact really easy, but it's like the most difficult easy thing you can possibly do. Because it's like you just sit there, and there have been times I will make the bread and I'll be sitting there with Jake, and I'm like, I just can't believe this is just flour and water and a little bit of salt. And I'm just sitting there marveling at the science of this bread that I made. And Jake's like, that's great. Just sure. I just want to eat the bread. It's not that exciting. I'm like, you don't understand. This was just flour and water. And it happened. And now it's floating. And so, because it gets really overwhelming, and it's filled with a lot of words that you have heard people say, but you've never heard them say it like that. And people will say things like, oh, well, here's a discard recipe. And you're like, I don't even know what discard is, much less why would I have a recipe for something else? And they'll say, oh, you need to feed the starter. You're like, I don't know what that even means. I want this to feed me and making a loaf of bread. So it's like, just find your one little recipe, and then you can always play with it from there, because so much of it is, ratios and percentages and things like that. It's kind of like, once you understand what you're doing, then you'll become more comfortable, and then you'll become able to see what works best for you. Because sometimes people say, oh, well, I followed these directions exactly, but it's really sticky, so I don't understand. Well, every starter and every sourdough is going to be totally different. Because like you could take San Francisco is famous for their sourdough. Well, you could take their starter and take it over to where you're at. Well, within 1 to 2 times, it's not going to taste the same anymore, even though you started with the same, because you're using the bacteria in the air, the bacteria in the water. What kind of water are you feeding it? You're never going to get the exact same thing. So sometimes people will be really excited over their starter. Oh, this is 100-year-old starter that got passed down. Technically mine that I got was one of these 100-year-old starters. It doesn't mean anything. It's so, I'm not feeding it with the same flour that someone fed it with 100 years ago. It's not going to taste like it tasted 100 years ago, and that's fine.
Some of the descendants of the original bacteria got to be there, right?
Yeah, sure.
But that original bacteria feeds on, calcium, magnesium, and hard water deposits or something. Well, then it's going to die off because you're probably using softened water now or something.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So people get really excited, and if they're really excited, good for them. I'm not going to sit there and, as the young people say nowadays, yuck on someone's yum, It's like, great, if you're...
I must not be on Facebook enough for that.
They maybe said it 6 months ago, maybe they don't even say it anymore. But I heard it once and it's stuck in my brain. But you're not going to sit there and tell someone, oh, well, that doesn't mean anything. Because if that means something to you, great. To me, I'll sit there and some people will feed their sourdough very specific, flours. And I'm like, I just get a big old bag of flour from Costco and my all-purpose flour, and I just get water from my sink, because my, the water here is pretty good. I have, the water over where my parents live has a lot more in it, so I have told them, do not use the water from your sink. I don't even like drinking the water from your sink. Don't feed it to your sourdough.
My wife's driving her grandma to Arizona for the winter, and then flying back. She's gone all week, right? Mm-hmm. So I texted her, like, hey, am I supposed to be doing something with this thing? Like, am I supposed to be feeding this stuff while you're gone? I have no idea. It got that little layer of, what'd you call it again?
Hooch.
The little layer of hooch, and I opened it up, it smelled it. I'm like, oh my gosh, it smells nasty.
Yeah.
Like, this is why they call it sourdough. Like, it does not smell good at that stage of the game.
It can smell a lot of different ways. When I went down, so you can get dehydrated starter. And so when I went down to California, I gifted my mom some dehydrated starter because it was just going to be easier to travel with. And so she tried starting it up. And apparently the instructions in there were very much written by someone who already knew how to do starter. So they oversimplified it to the point of, when you're first starting off, it doesn't make sense. It was very similar to the recipe that I first got on how to feed the starter, because I was given a certain amount, and the person who gave it to me said, feed it a cup and a cup, and then just stir it, and then put it in the fridge. And I only feed it like once a month, she said. I said, okay. Well, I didn't know that you're not supposed to just keep feeding it and have this massive quantity. There's percentages, that you're supposed to feed it. So all of a sudden, when I finally sat there months later thinking, okay, I'm going to figure this out, I went, oh, I have a massive quantity of starter, and I don't need anywhere near as much. It was still fine. Again, It didn't have mold, but it was definitely a lot of a learning curve. But my mom's, good golly, when she was feeding it at first, it smelled terrible. It smelled so bad. I was sitting there going, okay, I know they say that the only thing that makes this go bad is mold, but I don't think they've smelled this. But sure enough, I looked up and, okay, what if my starter smells weird? And, oh yeah, sometimes it smells like that. And I was like, oh gosh, okay, well mine luckily never has, but sorry, Mom, yours reeks. Just push through.
Yeah, so my experience with starter, I had my friend Micah stop over because he knew that Nora failed on the first attempt. And he came over and gave me this little jar and says, hey, tomorrow I'll just feed it. My understanding is when you give someone a starter, you take so many grams off or so much weight off of your original starter, put it in a new container. And I'm sure that amount that you take out could vary by whatever recipe you're looking at.
Yeah.
And then he told me to feed it 80 grams of water and 80 grams of flour. And so, like a 1-to-1 weight ratio. And so I did that, stirred it up and let it bubble, and then I threw it in the fridge. And that's where it sits. But as far as what I'm understanding is that's kind of like the first thing you do, perhaps when you get a starter from somebody, unless they've pre-fed it for you. The process of feeding it's just simply adding flour and water.
Right. For someone who's first beginning, you want to just do equal amounts because that makes the most sense. But realistically speaking, you can feed it any amount. So currently I have in my fridge, like what I keep on hand is like 35 grams is what I kept last time, because I made a loaf. That's what I just had left over. I went perfect. And when I feed it up for next time, because I'll need close to 200 grams, I'm just going to feed it a higher ratio. So it'll take longer for it to come to peak because it needs to work through all that flour, but it will eventually do it. So I've seen some people that all they keep is just the scrapings of the jar, and then they just refill it. And because it's enough bacteria, it'll take a lot longer. When you're feeding it 1-to-1, it's going to go through it a lot faster, but if your house is really warm, it's going to be a lot more active, a lot more quickly. Like my last loaf I made, I was like, oh, okay, I need to readjust my timings for things because we're getting cold, the house is getting cold, and everything is taking way longer than it took 2 months ago. It's all just ratios, and it's like, how much are you wanting? And so if you don't necessarily want a lot on hand, because obviously eventually if you keep on feeding it 1-to-1, you're going to have a huge, massive amount. And so that's where discard comes in, is that let's say you're saying, I want to maintain my yeast amount to, let's say, 150 grams. That's as much as I want to have on hand. Well, when you feed it and it gets up to 150 grams, tomorrow you're not going to want to feed 150 grams. You're going to want to feed, let's say, 50 grams. So you'll take out 100 grams and then just feed it back up and it'll go back up. Now, discard kind of is its own other thing, because technically if your starter is already active, you can essentially just pass that on to someone or have another starter.
Yeah, so your discard could almost be also termed a starter, right?
Yeah. So when I have been, because I've experimented with different flowers and different things, and so I've split it off before and then just used my discard as an okay, we're going to see how this works out instead. Or you can throw it away, obviously, discard in the name. Or you can, once it's active, there's a lot of recipes that people will use discard in. So you're not looking for it to be adding at that point any yeast benefit. Like, it's not going to be adding any leavening, but it'll be adding flavor. I don't really know too much about the health aspect, of like, the different bacteria and it adds to, I don't know too much about that. I mean, obviously it's cleaner, especially depending on the flour that you're using. I know that some people, like my sister, she's not celiac, but she's got a gluten intolerance. And she's currently working on sourdough because a lot of people who just have a gluten intolerance can eat regular sourdough just fine. Not everybody. And there are some people who will teach how to make an actual true gluten-free sourdough. But for some people who just have a gluten intolerance, they can find that because of the way that it eats all the yeast and everything like that, they can eat just regular sourdough fine.
That was one of the questions I had for you, because my wife's like gluten intolerant, the whole stomach issues or whatever goes with that. But we can go over to Italy and eat all the bread we want,
Yeah.
And then you go, the bread there tends to have like a harder crust, kind of like sourdough too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's not always the case. Any sourdough I've had always had like a harder crust, but maybe you can make it where it won't. I don't know. So I think part of the reason my wife's interested in that is because she's heard that some gluten intolerant individuals can actually consume it without having any issues.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, there's different flours and things like that. I mean, there's some people who will literally go to their local, miller or whatnot, who gets their own flour, and they go through that. The flours that I most often use, I'll use, again, the King Arthur flour or Bob's Red Mill are the two best ones that I like. They're a bit pricier, but I don't necessarily use them for the all-purpose, but I'll use it for the actual bread flour because it'll have a higher protein content. And so it balances up a lot more.
That was one of the things I was asking her, so like, you to feed this thing, or what I got to do this thing in the fridge, She's like, well,
yeah,
you can feed it if you want. I'm like, well, do I need gluten-free flour or not? She's like, no, you shouldn't need to. But I imagine you probably could feed it all gluten-free flour if you wanted.
I think you could. I know that I've kind of seen a couple of videos and a couple of recipes of people who have done gluten-free sourdough and explained how to make it. I kind of looked at them and then went, okay, well, if this, if making it regularly doesn't work out for my sister, there's options here, but I'm not going to bombard her, and I'm not going to go researching this unless she needs it.
Yeah, I know, because a lot of the gluten, results in like elasticity. It's like, I liked to bake as a kid and stuff, and I still did before I met Nora, who's no more like gluten-free, So then I'm like, well, there goes making bread out the window, because I can't, or pies, I can't make a crust to save my life anymore, because there's just the elasticity of a gluten-free dough is not there.
Yeah, I mean, there's newer ones now that they've recently been coming out with that are, giving you a bit more to work with. But yeah, there's generally speaking, I've seen my sister start to do gluten-free baking, and I'm like, wow, this is rough.
Yeah, it's not easy. I had a couple of different recipes that seem to work okay, but that's another thing I was going to ask you. So like, anytime anything I hear about sourdough, it's always a loaf. You make a loaf here, you make a loaf there, you just eat bread, right?
Yeah.
Do you make other baked goods with it besides like loaves and bread?
So I've pretty much made just loaves. The recipe that I use makes 2 loaves. And it makes everything a whole lot easier in my mind, because then I can keep the percentages and everything straight. Because everything essentially works off of a percentage based on how much flour you have. So because make 2 loaves and I use 1,000 grams of flour, everything else just becomes an easier percentage. Because then it's out of 1,000. So if I'm putting 700 grams of water, I know that's 70%. I don't have to do this, if I do 5 grams,
When you have your starter and
uh-huh.
can you walk through the process of like taking your starter, how you divide it out to keep some or whatever, and then what that looks like when you actually want to make a recipe? Are you actually like adding a bunch of flour right when you want to make your recipe, or is it like you have to add all the flour you want for a particular recipe and then wait several days and then bake it? Like, what's the process look like there?
Yeah. So if I were to want to make a loaf tomorrow, what I would need to do is pull out my starter from the fridge tonight. I will tell you, the technical actual, what some people will say is you want to feed it once and then feed it a second time, and that second feeding is the one that you use, to make the starter with, or the sourdough loaf. I've never had an issue coming straight out of the fridge and feeding it once and having it come up. I don't have the patience. So I just do it once and there you go. And all generally, because I want to be able to start it in the morning, I'll feed it the night before. I'll feed it a higher ratio so that it takes longer, so that when I wake up in the morning, it's either at peak or about to be at peak. And peak just means that's, when you have the most activity in it. So it's risen up, but it hasn't started falling down again. Because if you let it sit, it'll just start sinking back. It won't have the same bubbles to it. So I'll feed it the night before, and then in the morning, you first kind of have to hydrate the flour, get that kind of working, and then you'll add in however much starter you're going to put in. So for my recipe, I use 20%, which is 200 grams. So I'll just put in the 200 grams of starter into the flour and water, and then start going from there. And then whatever I have left over is just what I keep as my starter on hand. And so making the loaf itself is one of those, it's a lot of little moments where you sit there and you go, okay, I'm going to spend, especially at the beginning, okay, you're going to need it, the beginning is where you have most of the upfront time. Okay, we're mixing it, and then we're waiting 10 minutes, and then we're doing this, and then we're kneading it. But basically, once you have done the kneading on it, process on it, you're just working on 1 hour chunks. So you're going through every hour and you're doing what they call a tuck and fold, which is basically you're just essentially pulling it up 4 different sides. You're kind of turning it around 4 different sides, and you're pulling it up and folding it on top of itself. Almost like, you're folding up a burrito kind of. But that's going to tighten up the structure in there. You'll do it, and it takes you less than 5 minutes, and you can do whatever you want for an hour. And then, okay, my timer went off. Okay, here we go for an hour. And then, until it eventually will double in size. And then once it doubles in size, that's when you take it out and, shape it and put it into your banneton. Then you just let it sit, essentially, in the fridge. Once it's ready, you can let it sit anywhere from a day to 3 days. I personally have experimented with the first time I was trying, what's the difference? Does it develop more yeasty, more sour taste? And I mean, I thought it did, but I didn't think it developed enough. It was, actual different taste. It's essentially just you're putting everything on pause for a day or two, but it is developing some flavor. So I'll feed it one night, I'll work on the dough a whole day, and then the next morning or afternoon, I'll bake up one loaf after another. The one bummer thing with sourdough is because what makes it kind of crunchy on the outside is all that moisture and everything, the water that's trapped in there. So sourdough is one of the few loaves you do not want to cut warm, because then you're going to release everything that's been trapped inside, and then it won't be crunchy, and it'll be a bummer. And it's very difficult because, and that's honestly why I bake it first thing in the morning, so that I know at night I can eat my sourdough. Like, I don't want to wait 2 days to eat this. But yeah, and then I'll just bake it in the morning. So, I'll bake it. I've got like a Dutch oven. If you have a Dutch oven, great. I've recently started baking it in just like a roaster. Like, we just had Thanksgiving, those turkey roasters. And I'll bake it in that because I can access that a lot more quickly than I can access my big, huge, heavy Dutch oven. Some people will bake it open. I mean, there's so many different ways that people bake it.
So, I mean, it takes the shape of whatever container you put it in, basically?
It won't take the shape of the roaster itself. It'll take, because you do all the shaping after you've finished it. You do all the shaping. So you kind of fold it up and you roll it up.
Well, it's a stiff enough dough then.
Yeah. It is one of those moments you need to work quickly and do it quickly because I've heard people say that the dough can sense fear. And I think that's kind of accurate because if you start getting scared, then it starts getting sticky and then it's a mess and you're like, oh no, I've ruined this. But worst case scenario, you struggle and it's not working, or you've overproofed it, or I would just bake it. And, maybe I have made some very flat sourdoughs because I sped up things or I overproofed things or whatnot. It tastes the same. I have taken them to people before and I keep my mouth shut and everyone goes, wow, this is your best loaf yet. And I'm like, well, right, it's actually not, but thank you so much for the comment.
Is it kind of like regular bread where you can, if you're kneading it and stuff, you can just simply add a little more flour to it to get rid of the stickiness, or you can't do that?
You can, but actually what you want to do, because you don't want to add too much flour, when you're working on it, especially doing all the kneading, it's actually water. So you want to get your hand wet, like not dripping wet, but your hand kind of wet, and the water will repel it away. And then you do put some flour on, your counter or whatnot. But what I'll use is the rice flour because it doesn't absorb the moisture the same way. I don't know the science behind it. I just know that's what they say, and that's what I have found works. So
yeah, it'd probably be a little bit more grainy versus.
Yeah. So when I put it in, it's called a banneton, but some people, you could even use a bowl or whatnot, and that's what you have once you've shaped your dough. That's what you have it resting in, and then putting it in the fridge in it. And that's what I'll cover in a thin layer of rice flour. And when it comes out, some people brush it off. I'm fine with it kind of on there because then it just, some people will go really fancy and make patterns with it. And I'm like, I'm not going to go through that much work. I'm doing one slash and we're moving on with our life. Because you do want to do just a cut in it. I'm not sure if you've seen like on baguettes, they'll do kind of little slices on them. Yep. I want to do a slice on it because it's once your dough expands, with bread, it expands. It's going to expand in such a way it's going to burst. So all you're doing when you're cutting it is giving it a controlled place okay, that's where I'm going to burst then, rather than just bursting out a random spot on your dough. It'll taste the same. It'll just not look as pretty.
How do you like to eat your sourdough? You simply put some butter and stuff on it, or?
So the one thing that I've gotten, kind of fancy with is I will make some, I'll do some mix-ins. So the one that Jake is the biggest fan of, he really likes, I do a jalapeno cheese one. And so I'll mix that in and he loves that one. So that one goes through our house pretty quick. I have one that I really like that's kind of like a cranberry walnut one. I like it. Jake doesn't, so that one lasts a lot longer in our house.
Yeah, so what you're saying, you can just mix like an Italian herb seasoning into like your loaf, right? When you're doing like the kneading and the folding and stuff. And
yeah. So different people will mix in different things at different times. What I have found, I tried making one with blueberries, but because of all the moisture in the blueberries, I didn't feel like I got a good rise on it, and it didn't spread as well. It was one of the first ones I made. So I have just stayed away with putting too much moisture back into it again. One day I'll try again. But yeah, and then I'll just make plain ones, and we'll do a lot, of just toast or having it with some soup or making a grilled cheese. Pretty much anything that I could make it with bread. I actually had my sister-in-law recently got married over the summer, and for her bachelorette party, we did grilled cheese night. So I spent a week and I made all these loaves of sourdough bread, and I made like 3 different kinds. And so everybody had their pick of, okay, here's all these cheeses, here's all these meats you could put in it, and here's all these loaves of sourdough. It was very fun. It was a lot of work, and and by the last day was exhausted and burned myself very badly on the cast iron. So if you're going to get that exhausted, pay attention. The cast iron is still hot. But yeah, so that's mostly how I do it. I will make a lot of focaccias too. And that's my favorite discard recipe at the moment is I found a really good sourdough discard focaccia recipe. And that's nice, and I can make it within a day. You can put mix-ins and all these different kind of things. So I've made a pesto one. I've made a roasted garlic one, and then you just call it a day and make it a sandwich or just eat it as is.
Yeah, that's a lot more intriguing than because sometimes I think, okay, you're gonna get in this sourdough, and we're always gonna have the same old bread hanging around the house all the time.
Yeah,
it's definitely intriguing to see that and to know that you can do different things with it. Yeah.
Now, the one thing to keep into account with making sourdoughs, because it doesn't have the preservatives, which is great, it does not last nearly as long as any other bread. So people will kind of go through these, okay, how am I supposed to store it? I have found I kind of have like paper bags that it works well in, because if I put it in a plastic bag, all the moisture kind of gets trapped in there. Usually after the 3rd day, that's where I want it kind of at prime. I'll just slice it all up and I'll put it in the freezer. And then you can just pull it out as you need and toast it, and it's just as good as new. So we currently think I think we have 2 loaves of sourdough in our freezer. So
Norda kind of does that with her she'll buy gluten-free loaf, and she buys the Costco package of 2 or something, and one will go in the freezer. And I don't know. I swear, like when you put them in the freezer, they tend to get dried out, and as soon as you pull it, like I haven't done that with some like regular bread too. You pull it out of the freezer, and within like 2 days, it's like starting to be really dried out and stuff.
Some of them do. I do feel like sourdough doesn't have that same. I personally have found that sourdough, I'm not really able to taste the difference between a frozen and then toasted one, or a fresh one that was toasted. So.
Yeah. Imagine the density probably has a factor in that too. It's a little more of a dense bread than
it is. Yeah.
Holds the moisture a little bit better.
Mhm.
Wow. You said just looking into it was a information overload. I already feel like I got an overload.
Yeah. So that's the thing is that I'm like, look, I try to tell people, I'm like, okay, the problem is if you get me started, then you're gonna get overwhelmed. So I'm like, and even then, I'm like, I was trying to keep it. It's like, you could get so many different tools and so many different things. And so it was funny, like my sister, I said, was starting, and I told her, okay, here's all these tools you could possibly use. These are the top ones I would recommend you get. There's all these recipes. Here's the one recipe. I have like literally a drafted email that I sent to one person. One of Jake's coworkers wanted to get back into sourdough. So I put together an email, and I have just since then forwarded it to people. And I go, okay, here you go.
Would you mind forwarding it to
homegrownfam
at gmail.com?
I will forward you that email. A lot of people, I think, sit there and think, oh, well, it's so easy that, they've made it for years, and if our ancestors could do it, and it's like, sure, yes, it's not that complicated, but it also can be really overwhelming, and it's okay for it to be a little bit overwhelming. So
it'd be way more overwhelming if we had to cook it over a fire.
Yeah.
Like, could you imagine that?
Yeah.
Stick a stick in it and turn it so it bakes it.
Well, and what I think is funny too, sometimes people will think, oh, because ancestors did it, they use it almost as an excuse of shortcuts. And I'm like, let me tell you, I've done that philosophy before, and I've ended up with some bad loaves. Like, there is an actual science to it. And maybe don't try to shortcut it. You're still going to end up with a fine loaf if it doesn't work out. In worst case scenario, if it's not proofing up correctly, if it's not, just make it into focaccia and you're fine. I have never done it because I'm stubborn and I go, no, I put all this work in and this isn't becoming focaccia. But focaccia is also really good, and it's okay to just pivot really quick and make it into a focaccia loaf.
I gotta ask, what exactly is a focaccia?
Focaccia is a bread that is made in like a what is it called? Like a tin, like a loaf tin, kind of, but the wider one, like a casserole dish. That's what I'm trying to think. That size, like a 9x13, and it's just made with a lot of olive oil. And so you pretty much, it cooks up. It's really nice and light and airy, but you put like olive oil underneath, olive oil on top. And so it'll be nice and airy, but it'll already have that kind of olive oil. So if you ever go to a restaurant and you see that really fluffy bread, it's probably a focaccia.
You think it would make a good, like a bread pudding if it turned out to be bad?
Probably.
That's my
you don't
sweet
really
tooth
know
coming
until you've
out.
tried it.
Oh. In this email you're gonna send me, does it mention like the King Arthur baking?
Yeah.
And like that other gal that you mentioned and stuff?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
For our listeners, I'll post some. Probably won't post her whole email, but I'll pick out a couple different things that you mentioned throughout the episode here, and I'll throw it in the show notes for our listeners here. So that'd be good way to get started.
Yeah. The one thing I will tell people is, it can become very easily overwhelming. But if you find kind of your corner of what it works, and it's just practice and practice, and you'll sit there and your first loaf might not be very good, but that's okay. Just kind of keep pushing through. Because I have seen literally even professional chefs that are 3-4 years into making sourdough, and they go, oh, I think I finally have figured this out. Oh, okay. And then you see them a couple years later and they go, no, now I think I figured it out. So it's like I said earlier in the show, and I stole it from somebody. So to be fair, I stole it, I think, from Claire Saffitz. She says it's the easy, it's the most difficult, easy thing to do. But you just kind of have to, as boring as it is, practice makes perfect. But once you kind of become more comfortable with it, then starts making sense and you can do different things with it. But it's okay to be uncomfortable at the beginning. I don't think I've ever met anybody who has started off and not felt completely uncomfortable.
That's totally where me and Nora are right now.
Yeah.
But I gotta be careful too now. After talking with you a little bit, I'm like, oh, it seems a little bit more interesting. It's not just same old same. Like I could get like pretty creative with this stuff. And like, wait, no, Joe, it's not your hobby. You're not taking on another hobby. Save this one for Nora, okay?
Well, I will let you know that you did say at the top, you said you weren't a sourdough, you said you don't have a lot of experience with it, but we also need, I will tell you, on behalf of all of us wives that bake the sourdough, we need a husband to joyfully and excitedly eat the sourdough, because we have spent a lot of time making it. Perfect. So if anybody has ever gifted you the sourdough or has made you sourdough or given you a slice of their sourdough, know it took them a lot of time to make it, even if it was easy time and even if they enjoyed it. So we really do want someone to eat it and go, wow, this is amazing. And, that's all we need.
There you go. All right, we're butting up on some time here, so have to wrap it up here. But it was a great conversation with you, Michelle. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Of course.
If you enjoy the show, feel free to leave a rating and on the podcast. But keep a note or have a question for Michelle. I can forward it to her. Maybe.
Yep. If anybody has specific
if you're
questions.
curious and have specific questions, do you feel free to provide an email?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. What do we got?
My email is going to be Michelle, so my first name, Michelle, and the letter B as in boy, and then Sevigny, just my last name, @gmail.com.
Well, some people spell Sevigny pretty weird. So
it's true. It's I'm like, why did I put that out there? I'm like picturing the title, and it's gonna, it would have my name, but it's S as in Sam, Evigny.
There you go. So if you have a weird, quirky question about some sourdough or something or other and want an answer, she might be available to shoot you a response. So.
Yep. And if we get enough, we can always, or what if, do a follow up, and we can touch base with you on how your starter's doing. And
that's true. And we can do like a question and answer. That'd be kind of fun. If you guys have a dozen questions come up through the email chat here, or whatever, and then we could do a follow up. That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah. Sounds great.
I could do one of those, I don't know, YouTube live things, but I don't know how to do that yet, so that's not happening.
I know how to watch them, and I think that's about it.
That's about it. We're just going to stick to this one platform for now, but you can find us on, the Apple Podcasts, the Spotify, and all that stuff. If you really enjoy the episodes and want to, throw a little donation in there, you can click the support the link show on the bottom in the show notes, and it'll bring you to like Buy Me a Coffee website. It's not spam, I swear, okay? But you can do a little $5 donation to buy me a cup of coffee kind of thing, as I stay up late in the middle of the night editing these episodes. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you.